if you will, to open in your Old Testament to Exodus chapter 17. Exodus chapter 17. In our study this evening, I want us to begin by talking some about some things that took place after the Israelites had crossed the Red Sea, after they were delivered from their bondage in Egypt. They had been traveling in the desert for a period of time when they met their first opposition. They came across a group of people who are known as the Amalekites. And so here in Exodus chapter 17, and beginning in verse 8, it says, "Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. And so Moses said to Joshua, choose for us men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." And so Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. And whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew weary. And so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side. So his hands were steady until the going down of the sun, and Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this as a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." And Moses built an altar and called the name of it, "The Lord is my banner," saying, "A hand upon the throne of the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." The Amalekites are actually the distant cousins of the Israelites. Amalek was the grandson of Esau, Jacob's brother. He was the son of Eliphaz, who was the oldest son of Esau. We learned back in Genesis 36 and verse 12. And we know, if you go back to that history, we know that there was a little bit of tension between Jacob and Esau. And what you find as you continue to read through the scriptures is that there was not only hostility between the two brothers, but also between their descendants as well. And so the Amalekites bore great hatred for the Israelites. And it seems that for at least 400 years or so that they are down in Egypt, that hatred just grew and it had festered, had done that for all of those years. And so when the children of Israel came out of Egypt and came into the region where the Amalekites lived, there was immediate conflict. And as the Israelites journeyed through the wilderness, the Amalekites began to ambush some of them, those who were lagging behind. In Deuteronomy chapter 25 and verses 17 and 18, looking back on these events, it talks about that. They were picking off the weak and those who were just kind of lingering. And I suspect they were probably thinking to themselves, they wouldn't have much trouble with a bunch of recently released slaves. That's what the Israelites were. And this was kind of a desperate time for the Israelites. They were trying to march through the desert. They'd never been on a journey like this before. The people were growing weary, as you can imagine, and they had the Amalekites attacking them and cutting off the weak from among them. The Israelites didn't have much in the way of military experience. They'd been slaves in Egypt for generations, not fighters, and they couldn't rely on those kinds of things. And so the only thing they could rely upon was God. Now I want you to imagine for a moment that you are Joshua. Moses calls you and he says, "Joshua, here's the plan. I want you to choose some men, and I want you to go out and fight the Amalekites tomorrow. And I'm going to stand on the top of the hill with a stick in my hand. That's going to be my contribution." Well, the old guy's kind of lost it. Kind of what I would have thought about that. It doesn't sound like a great plan to me, Moses. But the thing is, this was no ordinary stick. It was the staff that God had been using since the burning bush in Exodus chapter 4. It was the staff that became a snake and ate all the snakes of Pharaoh's magicians. It was the staff that touched the Nile and turned it to blood. It was the staff that Moses lifted as the Red Sea was being divided for Israel to walk through on dry ground. It was the staff that struck the rock from which water then gushed forth. This was the staff that Moses held up while the people went into battle. And the Israelites couldn't prevail in this situation by their own strength. As a bunch of recently released slaves, they couldn't defeat a bunch of warriors. But when that staff was raised, this group of former slaves, they were victorious. And the power's not in the staff. You know that already. It is the God who is behind it. This is the staff of God, we're told. And the Lord is my banner. A banner, in the sense that this word's being used here, is a standard, a rallying point around which people draw together for some common action or for the communication of important information. In ancient times, in the old days, people would rally together around a banner for a variety of purposes. But one of the most significant of those was the gathering of troops for war. In other words, Moses was saying that the Lord is the point around which the people were to gather in order to engage in this battle. He was the standard or the ensign under which they would fight. And when we look at what the scriptures say, they point out that the journey of the Israelites as they made their way to the promised land is, at least in some ways, comparable to ours as Christians. Ours is a spiritual journey, but there are points of similarity all the same. We sing songs at times that indicate as much. And what I want us to see this evening is that our text points out that we will not experience defeat in this endeavor as long as we march under the standard of God, if the Lord is our banner. And that is an important lesson for us to understand as God's people. And so I want us to talk about some things that are related to that in our lesson this evening. And as we begin, I want us to apply 3 principles from this passage to our situation as those whose home is not this world. Those who are strangers and who are aliens here, who are looking forward to the promised land. And these are not really new principles, but I think they're worth repeating. And the first thing that I want you to see this evening is that we can't experience salvation without experiencing conflict. That's something you see all through the scriptures, isn't it? We have to fight for that. And before we get too far into talking about that, I do want to point out that I'm not saying that somehow we fight and we battle and we earn our way into heaven. The work of salvation, the work of freeing the slaves, you might say, that is God's work. And we would never have been able to free ourselves from our sins, just like the Israelites would have never been able to free themselves from their bondage in Egypt. There was nothing nothing we could do to bring about deliverance. God alone is the one who delivers. And Moses had made that point to the Israelites just before this in Exodus chapter 14, just before the Israelites crossed through the Red Sea. He would say in Exodus 14 and verse 13, "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you're never going to see them again." God's going to do that for you. Their salvation came from him. And again, the scriptures compare the exodus of the children of Israel to our own salvation. And we can make the same point with regard to our salvation as well. God saved us. He set us free. And there was nothing that we could have done that would have brought about that deliverance from sin except for the saving work of God on our behalf. Salvation is his work. But I'll tell you, if there's one thing we can learn from our text, it's that the redeemed life is not free from either work or war. That's just the reality of it. It's not that those who are saved by God sit back and do nothing. You know, many people in this world don't seem to get that. They don't seem to understand that. That we haven't been set free to sit back and do as we please. We have been set free to stand up and fight. It's interesting that shortly after the Israelites were delivered by God from their bondage in Egypt, that they were confronted here with the Amalekites. When they were confronted with these hostile people, God didn't say, "I tell you what, y'all sit on the hill and I want you to watch what I'm going to do on your behalf." He had the Israelites engage them in battle. They had to fight. They had to do that. And I recognize when we begin to talk about our own situation, as Paul would say in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12, our struggle is not against flesh and blood. That's one of the ways in which it differs from what we see in the Old Testament. But there are plenty of passages in the Bible, including this one here in Ephesians, that tell us that to be a Christian is to be a soldier in the Lord's army. And that's why Paul would say things like 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 12, "Fight the good fight of the faith." That's why he would say in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 11, "Put on the whole armor of God." Because the devil would love nothing more than to come along and to take out the weak and to take out the weary, those who are lagging behind. And that's why God encourages us to put on the armor and to take a stand, because we will face the enemy. But second, I want you to see that we can't afford to rely on our own strength, not as we face this enemy. The enemy we face is too powerful for us, at least on our own. And it seems to me that the Israelites had to learn that lesson the hard way, not long after their experience with the Amalekites, actually. If you recall, Israel ended up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. That wasn't God's original plan, but that's how things ended up. And so Moses had led the people right up to the border of the land of Canaan. They sent in spies from each of the 12 tribes to go into the land and to spy it out. But when they came back, do you remember the report? It's found in Numbers chapter 13 and verse 31. We have 10 of the 12 who come back and they say this: we are not able. We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. And so the people of Israel gave in to the cowardice of the 10 spies, and the Lord was angry with them as a result of that. And that's when he sentenced the Israelites to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And when the Lord passed that sentence, the Israelites didn't like that news. They'd had enough of the wilderness and the time they had already spent there. And they weren't really all that interested in staying any longer. And so the day after Moses told them the bad news, we're told in Numbers 14 and verse 40 that they rose early in the morning and went up to the heights of the hill country, saying, here we are. We will go up to the place that the Lord has promised, for we have sinned. We've changed our minds. We're ready to go into battle because we don't want to hang out in the wilderness anymore. They changed their minds. But so had God. Moses tried to warn them, and it didn't matter. They started to try to take the land that day. And you know the rest of that story. We read it in Numbers chapter 14 and verse 41. Moses said to them, why now are you transgressing the command of the Lord, when that will not succeed? Do not go up, for the Lord is not among you, lest you be struck down before your enemies. For there the Amalekites and the Canaanites are facing you, and you shall fall by the sword, because you have turned back from following the Lord, and the Lord will not be with you. But they presumed to go up to the heights of the hill country, although neither the ark of the covenant of the Lord nor Moses departed out of the camp. Then the Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in that hill country came down and defeated them and pursued them even to Hormah. I'll just tell you, that story is a perfect illustration of the fact that we can't go into battle alone and win. We don't have the strength to do that. And that's why Paul, in the passage in Ephesians chapter 6, before he even talked about putting on the armor of God, would say there in Ephesians 6 and verse 10, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. That's the prerequisite to all of this. It is foolish to go into battle relying on our own strength rather than God's, because it will not work, as Moses said. But there's a third thing I want you to see, and that is that we can't be defeated if our strength comes from God. We can easily be defeated on our own, but not if he's on our side. Have we come to understand that God wants his people to be victorious, that that's really what he wants for us? He wants to give us the victory. In fact, we can even be confident that the victory is ours if the Lord is our banner, to borrow the language from our text. That we don't have to run or we don't have to surrender. God never meant for his people to do that. I've read at various times when looking at the passage about the armor of God in Ephesians chapter 6 that several writers have pointed out that when the Apostle Paul listed the individual pieces of armor, he didn't list any armor for the backside. And the conclusion they reach is that he didn't do that because God never intended for his people to turn around and run. Well, I'm going to tell you that's probably reading a whole lot more into that passage than really is warranted. But the point's true all the same. God doesn't intend for us to turn around and run. He intends for his army to stand and to fight, to advance by the strength that he supplies. And that doesn't mean that the battle will never get fierce, and it doesn't mean that there will never be any casualties. You've known some, and so have I. But what it does affirm is that the one who is for us, he is greater than the one who is against us. And if the Lord is on our side, we don't have to worry about who will win the victory, because the victory belongs to God. And we have to ask the question, do we believe that? Do we really believe that we can't be defeated with the Lord as our strength? Is there anything that we can point to in our lives and say, the only way I can explain this victory over this evil is because God is at work in my life? Can you see things like that in yours? Can we honestly say that? Sometimes it seems to me that we don't believe it like we should. And the reason I say that is because we sometimes choose to stay in the camp rather than get out into the battle. We're hesitant to face it, aren't we? There's not a way around that. And the problem may be that we either don't understand how serious the war is or we don't trust in the strength of our God. But either way, it ends the same way. Do we believe what God has revealed about himself? Do we believe that we can't be defeated if he is our strength? We need to understand. We need to firmly believe these things. And then we need to act on them. I want us to spend the rest of our time this evening talking about how important it is for us to rally around the Lord our banner. Again, to use that language from the text. And I want us to notice three things about what it means for the Lord to be our banner. And the first thing that I want you to see is it means that we declare our allegiance. That's what it means. You see, each of us has been called upon to make the Lord the point around which we rally. As I said earlier, that was at least one of the purposes of a standard or a banner or an ensign. We're called to ask ourselves, where does my allegiance lie? You ever notice that fans tend to wear their team colors and their team logos and things like that, and they do that with pride? Have you ever noticed how vocal some people can be about their favorite sports team and how quiet they can be about their God? Can people see where your allegiance lies as you live from day to day? You know, the battle for allegiance is a fierce one. Our country wants our allegiance, our families want our allegiance, our employers want our allegiance, and you could go on down the line. And all of those things are fine when we keep them in perspective. But it's not always easy to do that, is it? Do we recognize where our primary allegiance lies? We need to see that God, He demands our uncompromised allegiance, complete. In Luke chapter 14 and verse 26, Jesus would say, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. That's how serious that is. But there's a second thing that I want you to see. If the Lord is our banner, it also means that we define our adversaries. Let me say a word about banners or standards. One reason banners were so important all the way through really the Middle Ages was because they identified which side you were on. That's what we were just talking about. You know, armies didn't always color coordinate, so to speak. And you have the red on this side and you have the blue on this side, and you just know that the person you're fighting is wearing the opposite color. They didn't always do that. They didn't distinguish themselves from one another. And so they knew which guys they were fighting, at least in part, by which banner they were fighting under. And if we choose to line up on the Lord's side, we choose to place our allegiance there, then let me tell you, we can also expect to set ourselves up as someone's enemy. Just a fact. Have you ever noticed that when you begin to talk about the Lord or about what's right and what's wrong, that sometimes people take a different attitude towards you? That's a good example of what we're talking about here. When the standard is raised, some people will want to see you as the enemy. And that's why those who decide to follow the Lord have to decide that they're ready to have some enemies, because they will. There will be some. Your enemies will be defined. And then third, if we rally around the Lord as our banner, what it will also mean is that our associates are defined as well. See, I don't believe the Lord ever intended for us to fight the battle alone. Not even just us and him together, me and the Lord. The Lord's will is that we fight side by side. When you look at our text, Moses wasn't by himself. He had people there to help him. And are we as quick to join each other in the thick of the battle as they were? I think that's a great question. When we are under attack, who is going to be there to hold up our hands? Or maybe the better question to that is, when others are under attack, are we going to be there holding up their hands? That's the question. And the point I'm trying to make is that we need to be there for one another. And it may be that one of the best ways you can do that at times, it may be that the best thing you can do is you can pray for somebody else. You know, it's always been interesting to me. We've gone back to Ephesians chapter 6 a few times, and after talking about the full armor of God and putting on the different pieces of it and standing and fighting, Paul said this. He encouraged his readers in verse 18 of Ephesians chapter 6. He encouraged them to be praying at all times in the Spirit with all prayer and supplication. Then he went on to say there in verse 18 as well, to that end, keep alert with all perseverance, making supplication for all the saints. Why would you put that there? Is that just a coincidence? I don't think so. It's because these things go together. It's one of the ways we're there for one another. You know, there may be times when we go back and we read through the Old Testament, we're doing that again. You know, we're starting our yearly Bible reading, and when we read through the Old Testament, there may be times when we wonder, come across things and think, is there really any point of application there for us? I mean, we live at a different time, under different circumstances. It doesn't look the same today as it did then. But the words of the Apostle Paul are still true. And he wrote in Romans 15 and verse 4, that whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction. We can learn something from it. We're meant to learn something from it. These lessons are for us. These things were recorded for us, people who live under the new covenant. And there are lessons that we can learn from what happened to God's people in times past. But the question for us is this: will we do that? Will we learn the lessons that God is trying to teach us in these great stories of old? It's not just about Israelites wandering in a desert and fighting people and doing stuff like that. It's a lesson about how it works. Yes, our battle is spiritual, but it's real all the same. It's not any less real than it was for them. And it requires us to have the right attitude and to have the willingness and to put forth the effort. And the question we have to ask is, are we willing to do that? We may have someone here tonight who's never chosen to serve under the banner, so to speak, to rally to where the Lord is, to be a child of God. You never obeyed the gospel of Christ. Why not? Why not tonight? Why not declare your allegiance? You know, that's what we do in the process of obeying the gospel. When we believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, what we're saying is, I believe he is king. And because he is king, I'm going to change my life to live in keeping with his will. And when I'm in front of other people, I'm going to confess that I believe this. I'm going to declare my allegiance. And then I'm going to join with him in a death like his, being buried with Christ in baptism, in which I'll also be raised with him to life. That's what we do when we obey the gospel. We declare our allegiance. If you've never done that, why not do that tonight? If you've not been living like someone who's declared your allegiance, why not start that? Why not get back on track? And if we can help you in some way, we ask you to come as we stand and as we sing.
Hear the blessed Savior calling thee out.